Today our investigation takes us to Oak Hill, West Virginia, United States. Now, picture a small city of just a little over 8,000 people, nestled right in the heart of Fayette County. This area, it's deeply rooted in Appalachian history, once a booming coal town, and these days, a gateway to the stunning New River Gorge, a place known for its beautiful outdoors and a strong, tight-knit community spirit. If you were to stand there on an autumn evening, you'd feel that cool, crisp mountain air. You'd hear the quiet hum of a passing truck, the wind rustling through the pine trees, maybe a distant train whistle. The neighborhoods, they're made up of modest homes, with aging porches and quiet, winding lanes tucked into the wooded hillsides. It all looks so peaceful. Life here seems gentle. Neighbors wave to each other from their yards. Kids ride their bikes down sleepy streets as the sun sets. It's the kind of place that feels insulated, safe, where you just don't expect anything bad to happen. But if you look a little closer, sometimes there's an uneasy quiet that falls over certain streets. A sense that maybe some doors are locked a little tighter than others. It's a place where nothing like this should ever happen. Until it does. But one thing that paints this city dark is the brutal murder of 8-year-old Jolan Browning. Oh, and before we really get into it, do me a favor. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what the weather's like there right now. I honestly love scrolling through and seeing all the places you guys tune in from. I read every single one. The official report would later state that Jolan's passing was linked to severe infection and complications from illness. But those clinical terms barely hint at the heartbreak that unfolded that winter evening in 2018, just a day after Christmas, inside the home where she lived. When emergency services were called, responders arrived to a scene filled with silence and confusion. Jolan wasn't responding. Efforts to revive her proved that something had gone terribly wrong long before that night. Even the medical equipment struggled to get a proper reading, a chilling sign of how far things had gone. Inside the home, investigators noted signs that Jolan's health had been declining for quite some time. She had grown frail, her body weakened, and her breathing had become more and more difficult in the days leading up to that call. Those who lived there would later recall moments of worry, moments that, looking back, spoke volumes. So, how had no one intervened? How had the protective systems failed? And who would be held accountable? Now, to truly understand this tragedy, we have to get to know the little girl at the very heart of it. Her name was Jolan Browning. She was born in 2010, which meant she was just 8 years old when she died in December of 2018. Jolan's home life was complicated. She lived under the care of her biological father, Marty Browning Jr., along with his partner, Julie Tichenell, and Julie's sister, Sherry. There were other kids in the house, too, including at least one sister. But here's the thing that observers would later point out. Jolan wasn't biologically related to Sherry, and it seems she was often treated very differently from the other children. She was singled out. For a while, Jolan did go to public school, and this is where some of the first, heartbreaking signs appeared. Her teachers noticed things. A physical education teacher, Carrie Chiliberti, testified that she saw bruises and scabs on Jolan. Sometimes, Jolan would ask her for an extra shirt. And in a moment that just chills you to the bone, Jolan once told this teacher that if she had any questions about the bruises, she should just ask her father. It was a quiet, coded cry for help. But then, that outside oversight was taken away. After these reports were made to Child Protective Services, Jolan was pulled out of public school to be homeschooled. And in that isolated environment, things got much worse. Reports indicate she was often excluded, forced to walk the halls or stand as punishment while the other children carried on with their activities. She was cut off from the world. Yet, Jolan was still a child. She had a personality, a spirit. We know she would sometimes ask cafeteria workers for extra food, a clear sign she wasn't getting enough at home. In her final days, her sister, known in court documents as BM, noticed Jolan was getting very sick. BM testified that Jolan sounded like she couldn't breathe, like she was fighting for air. She tried to tell the adults she was unwell. She was reaching out for the most basic relief. Even in her suffering, she reached out, not for blame, but for help. She trusted her caregivers, even as they failed her. Her life was small and unremarked, even by the institutions that should have protected her. And on that fateful December day, what she had been enduring, seen by few, heard by fewer, came to its harrowing climax. So let's walk through Rayleigh's final day. It was December 26th, 2018. By this point, her sister, BM, had already testified that Rayleigh had been getting progressively worse. She had been making these labored breathing sounds, almost like a snore, a clear sign she was struggling for air. Now, in the early morning, around 8 a.m., the household would have been stirring. But for Rayleigh, there was no normal routine. According to that testimony, she wasn't being given proper food or water. So imagine that. The day begins, and a child is already in a state of deprivation. As the day wore on, things only got worse. By the afternoon, around 1 p.m., her condition had deteriorated significantly. She was becoming increasingly lethargic, likely unable to sit up or walk. Any attempts she might have made to ask for help, for a simple drink of water, were ignored. The adults in the house dismissed her severe symptoms as something minor. By the evening, around 6 p.m., she was even weaker. If there was any family activity, she was too ill to be part of it. Her breathing became more and more shallow. And then, as night fell, around 8:30 p.m., she likely slipped into a state of semi-consciousness. It's a terrifying thought. The adults in the home saw her in this critical state and still did not act with any urgency. There was talk of maybe taking her to the hospital, but it was postponed. The critical moment came late that night. Around 11:45 p.m., one of the caregivers, Sherry Tichenell, finally called for an ambulance, claiming Rayleigh had suffered a seizure. But when the EMTs arrived, what they found was utterly devastating. Rayleigh was unresponsive. She wasn't breathing and had no pulse. She was described as cold to the touch, so cold, in fact, that medical instruments later couldn't even register her body temperature. She was rushed to Plateau Medical Center, but it was too late. Medical staff confirmed she had no signs of life. It was clear she had been in that state for some time before the call was ever made. What followed that night would not only be an investigation, but a reckoning. In that silence, the system would begin to crack. So, after that late-night ambulance call, the immediate aftermath in that house was just a heavy, awful silence, you know? The kind of quiet that feels louder than any noise. And honestly, you can just imagine the other kids in the home, like her sister BM, who had already been so worried, now completely stunned, trying to process what was happening. The adults, well, their reactions were a mix. There was definitely panic, that initial frantic energy of calling for help. But then, when first responders got there, some of them seemed to shift, becoming almost too calm. Like, they were already trying to explain things away, saying she had a seizure, that it was some sudden, unexpected thing. But the scene itself told a different story. The paramedics, they're trained for this, right? But what they found, it was clear this wasn't a new situation. Rayleigh was unresponsive, with no signs of life. She was so cold. And I guess, in that moment, the professionals in the room knew immediately that they were too late. They worked, they did everything they could, but it was no use. And meanwhile, you have this just heartbreaking contrast. The sterile, focused effort of the medical team against the sheer, quiet shock of the other children in the house. There were no loud outbursts, just this devastating, numb silence. The people who should have been most upset seemed controlled, while the innocent bystanders were just shattered. She was pronounced gone at the hospital. She was beyond saving. And that left everyone with the most urgent, burning question. How had this child been allowed to reach such a state? Who would answer for this failure? That's when the focus had to shift from medical tragedy to a criminal investigation. The police were now on the scene, and they had to start piecing together a story that, to be honest, was already beginning to unravel. So, the official response kicked off with that emergency call from Sherry Tichenell. She told the dispatcher that Rayleigh had a seizure and wasn't breathing. And, you know, that kind of call immediately sends everyone, EMS, police, the whole system, in a high gear. Now, while that was happening, law enforcement was arriving on the scene. We're talking about the Oak Hill Police Department, with Detective Sergeant James Pack eventually taking a lead role. And right away, you could tell the officers were picking up on some weird vibes. The house itself seemed pretty normal on the surface, you know? No signs of a break-in or anything like that. But then you'd notice the little details, or honestly, the lack of certain things. There wasn't really any food or water around for her, and the sleeping arrangements were, let's just say they were unusual. Investigators also found some items in the bedroom Rayleigh shared with Sherry that, well, raised a lot of questions. A hammer was there, and a personal item, and Sherry couldn't really give a good explanation for why they were in a child's room. It just added to the overall sense that something was very wrong in that home. And here's the thing that really got to investigators later on. This wasn't the system's first contact with Rayleigh. Child Protective Services had files on her. But, and this is a big problem, those records weren't shared quickly or completely with the police. It was like the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing, and a child fell through the cracks. So, Rayleigh was pronounced dead at the scene. And in that moment, the focus shifted completely. It was no longer a medical call, it was a death investigation. The family's horror was met with the careful, methodical work of the investigators cataloging everything. What would unfold was not just a hunt for a perpetrator, but an excavation of failures, silence, and complicity. Alright, so now the investigation is in full swing. And I've got to tell you, this is where things get really complex and honestly, frustrating. Because piecing this together was like trying to solve a puzzle in the dark. So first, investigators secure the house. They're taking photographs, gathering any physical evidence they can find. And they're documenting everything about Rayleigh's condition, the various marks on her body, old injuries, signs that this wasn't a one-time thing. Then comes the autopsy report. The official cause of death was sepsis, stemming from a severe bronchial pneumonia. But here's the critical part the pathologist stressed. This didn't just happen out of the blue. The symptoms, labored breathing, coughing, would have been obvious to anyone caring for her over a period of days. It wasn't something you could miss. On top of that, she was severely dehydrated and malnourished, which, as experts testified, cripples a person's immune system. A treatable illness becomes a death sentence. This is where the testimony from her sibling, BM, becomes so vital. BM described hearing Rayleigh struggle to breathe, sounding like she was fighting for air. And BM also stated she never saw the adults give Rayleigh any food or water in those final days. So you have this first-hand account that perfectly matches the medical evidence. It's a powerful and devastating connection. Now, investigators are also building a timeline. They're looking at phone records, checking EMS logs, and most importantly, they're trying to get records from Child Protective Services. And this is where they hit a massive obstacle. The CPS files, which should have contained prior complaints from teachers about bruises and concerns, were slow to arrive and reportedly incomplete. It was like a major part of the story was being withheld. How can you protect a child if the agencies that are supposed to help aren't talking to each other? Then you have the behavior of the adults. Their stories were all over the place. First, they blamed her medications. Then, they said she fell in the shower. The excuses kept changing. And don't forget, they had pulled her out of public school right after those initial abuse reports started coming in. That isolated her completely. It's a classic and tragic pattern. So, with all this, the focus zeroes in on the three adults in the home. Rayleigh's father, Marty Browning Jr., his partner Julie Tichenel, and Julie's sister, Sherry Tichenel. They all shared responsibility for her care. But why would they let this happen? Prosecutors inferred it was about control, about concealing the ongoing situation in that house. Rayleigh was treated differently from the other children, singled out. And you have to ask yourself, how did they get away with it for so long? With all the signs, with school reports, with CPS involvement, how? The system seemed to have multiple chances to step in, and each time, it failed. So, with the case finally coming together, despite all the roadblocks, investigators prepared to make their move. The weight of the inquiry was now pointing squarely at the people who were supposed to be her protectors. What came next was the moment of arrest, and the beginning of a long legal battle to hold them accountable. So, about a year after Rayleigh's death, in December of 2019, the three adults in the home were arrested. Marty Browning Jr., Julie Browning, and Sherry Tichenel were taken into custody on serious charges, including child neglect resulting in death. There wasn't a dramatic standoff, but you can imagine the heavy weight of that moment. The formal handcuffing, the processing, the reality of the situation finally setting in. The trial that followed was a real legal battle. The prosecution's case was built on a simple, yet devastating, premise. They argued that the sustained neglect, the failure to provide water, food, and medical care to a visibly ill child, is what directly caused Rayleigh's death from sepsis. They presented powerful evidence. The medical experts who stated her symptoms would have been obvious. The sibling BM who testified to hearing Rayleigh's labored breathing and seeing the lack of care, and the physical evidence from the home, like that unexplained hammer found in the bedroom. The defense, on the other hand, tried to frame it as a tragic but unforeseeable medical event. They suggested her death was sudden, that maybe her medications played a role, and that the caregivers didn't willfully let this happen. They challenged the evidence, trying to have certain statements excluded and arguing that the link between the neglect and her death wasn't so clear-cut. But then came what you might call the smoking gun moment. It was the testimony from BM, Rayleigh's sibling. Her simple, straightforward account of Rayleigh's declining health and the absence of any basic care was just so compelling and hard to dismiss. It was matched by the medical examiner's firm statement that any reasonable person would have recognized the urgent need for medical intervention. And then there were those delayed and incomplete CPS records, which painted a picture of a system that had multiple opportunities to step in but failed. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. You had emotional weight on one side and sharp legal maneuvering on the other. The defense objected, the prosecutors pressed their points, and the jury watched it all. The key question hanging in the air was always, why didn't they get her help? Finally, after all the arguments and evidence were presented, the jury retired to deliberate. The entire courtroom fell into a hushed, anxious silence, waiting for a verdict that would define justice for Rayleigh. The verdict was in. The jury found Marty Browning Jr., Julie Browning, and Sherry Tichenell guilty of child neglect resulting in death, though they were acquitted on the abuse charges. Then, on August 21, 2022, the judge in Fayette County Circuit Court delivered the sentence. The three were handed prison terms ranging from 3 to 15 years for their roles in the tragedy. In the courtroom, the emotional release was palpable. There were tears, a collective gasp, and then a heavy silence as the weight of the moment settled. Family members gave victim impact statements, their voices raw with grief. They spoke of a future stolen, of a void that could never be filled. One relative expressed that while they came for justice, what they truly sought was an acknowledgement that Rayleigh's life mattered, that she was seen. Outside the courthouse, the public reaction was swift. There were cameras, community members, and calls for change. Reporters highlighted efforts by legislators to push for Rayleigh's Law, a proposed bill aimed at preventing similar tragedies by closing loopholes that allow children to be homeschooled amid ongoing abuse investigations. On social media and in op-eds, the conversation ignited, with many expressing outrage that the system had failed so profoundly and others debating the adequacy of the sentences. As the courtroom emptied, the family lingered, sharing quiet hugs and wiping away tears. There was a sense of relief, not for vengeance, but for the long-awaited recognition of Rayleigh's suffering and her worth. Yet, for some, the punishment felt insufficient for the immense loss of a young life. But in the wake of judgment, the question remains, will we ever truly stop this from happening again? The tragedy of Rayleigh Browning's death sent shockwaves that reached far beyond the courtroom, sparking a determined push for change. In her name, West Virginia lawmakers introduced Rayleigh's Law, legislation designed to prevent a child from being withdrawn from public school for homeschooling if there is an active Child Protective Services investigation. The goal was simple: to close a loophole that can isolate a vulnerable child from outside observers. While the bill has seen some legislative hurdles, its very introduction has forced a crucial conversation about oversight and safety. Culturally, this case became a stark warning. It highlighted how the isolation of a child, especially after abuse reports, can have the most severe consequences. It reminded teachers, neighbors, and entire communities that they are a vital safety net, and that speaking up isn't just an option, it's a moral imperative. In child welfare circles, Rayleigh's story is now cited as a painful example of systemic failure, underscoring the desperate need for better communication between schools, CPS, and law enforcement. Yet, controversies and questions still linger. Some debate the sufficiency of the sentences, while others ponder whether every party responsible was truly held accountable. The recent Supreme Court decision to uphold the convictions provides legal closure, but the broader, more difficult work of fixing the system continues. The powerful lesson here is that neglect can be fatal, and it must be met with proactive, vigilant protection. Rules around homeschooling need safeguards, and agencies must break down the silos that allow children to fall through the cracks. The cost of this crime is measured not just in years of prison, but in the silence of her laughter, the dreams she never lived, the trust she extended to those meant to protect her. Oak Hill, West Virginia, a quiet city now forever marked by one girl's death, stands as a somber reminder of the enduring need to ensure this never happens again. The true depth of this tragedy lies in the number of times the system was alerted, and yet it still failed. Teachers, like Carrie Chiliberti, did their duty. They saw the bruises, they noted the hunger, and they filed reports with Child Protective Services. But those reports, that open file, didn't trigger the decisive action that was needed. The information stalled, it wasn't shared effectively with law enforcement, and a critical window for intervention closed. Then, the caregivers used a legal loophole. They withdrew Rayleigh from public school to homeschool her. This move, which happened after abuse reports were made, effectively removed the last set of outside eyes. It isolated her completely. The very institutions designed to be a safety net, CPS and the education system, proved to be full of holes. The media's role came later. Journalists connected these dots, showing how the homeschooling policy, combined with agency and action, created a perfect storm. This coverage helped push for legislative change, but it also forces a difficult question about public trust. If a child can be in this much distress, with so many points of contact, and still slip through, who can we rely on to keep children safe? This isn't just about the failures of 3 individuals. It's about a collective responsibility that was neglected. It's about the gaps between our institutions that are just wide enough for a child to disappear. In the silence between institutions, Rayleigh's voice still asks, "Why wasn't I saved?" Our answer, or failure to answer, will haunt us. Oak Hill, West Virginia, looked like a safe community. From the outside, it was. Jolan Browning seemed like just another little girl. But her story reveals how fragile that safety can be. She didn't pass away from a sudden, unknown illness. Her health declined over a period of days, in a home with adults who did not provide the most basic care and a system that did not hear the alarms. This forces us to reflect on our own duty. It's a moral obligation to notice, to question, and to act when something seems wrong. It's about refusing to look away. If a child's life can be lost in such a quiet, neglected way, we have to ask ourselves how many others remain invisible. Rayleigh's legacy must be one of change. Her name is now tied to efforts for legal reform, for greater public awareness, and for demanding that our institutions do better. It's a call for vigilance, for accountability, and for building systems that are truly humane. So, as we leave Oak Hill, we are left with a final, powerful image. Not one of noise, but of silence. An empty space where laughter should have been. A simple glass of water that was never offered. In the silence of Oak Hill, we must continue to listen, for Rayleigh, for every child whose voice has been silenced, and vow that no home becomes a tomb again.